Today's presentation is a member-led reflection on freedom and what it means to each of us. We will have 3 speakers who have prepared some ideas, and then hopefully we'll also have some time for other people to share their reflections on what freedom means to them. So if you would please join me in welcoming up first Joey Cole.
Probably, but no, I'm okay.
Well, no, I'll get you a stool and you can do some handheld if you'd like.
No, I'm okay. I'm fine. I can see over. They asked me if I wanted a stool. I love it. My sons always say I'm vertically challenged. This is the time of the year when you hear politicians giving speeches about our country and the heroes that sacrificed so that we would have freedoms we now enjoy. And that's wonderful. I consider myself a very patriotic person. But it really worries me that we have a very skewed view of history. If you believe this country was built on freedom, you're right, but it was also built on the backs of a lot of people that didn't enjoy that freedom. All of those hard-won freedoms that came out of the Revolutionary War applied only to white men who had land, who owned land. And that part is often glossed over in our history classes. The land that those men owned was literally stolen, as we know, from native peoples who were here when our European ancestors arrived on these shores. Through bigotry, a shameless sense of entitlement, unbridled violence, and broken treaties over 2 centuries, our forefathers stole this country inch by inch from its original inhabitants. What about their freedom? Also, our country was built on the backs of many who never got to enjoy any of the freedoms promised in our founding document, the Constitution. Slavery, already an integral part of the development of our nation, produced one of the first compromises during the writing of our Constitution. Southern states wanted to count their property, meaning slaves, for representation/power purposes. More people, more representation. They did not want to pay taxes on that property, however. So the 3/5 clause was added. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 establishes that an African, those forcibly brought to this country against their will, working without wages, being bought and sold, counted as 3/5 of a person, little over half. I always had a hard time wrapping my mind around that idea when I was a kid, when we learned about it. And I think I'm pretty safe in assuming that today most students have never even heard of the 3/5 compromise. Now, I don't think I have to get into the mess we've made of our Civil War history, but I will share with you a story that illustrates how that history is portrayed. Less than 5 years ago, a very intelligent young woman from this very congregation told me that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. Yes, I replied, the rights of the states to spread slavery. Considering herself a real Southern girl, she was shocked that I saw it that way. All this leads me to something I discovered about 4 years ago when I accompanied a bunch of Beacon teens on a civil rights trip planned by John Mowbray. Sit there in the back. Hi, John. John really planned this whole thing out, and in preparing them for the trip, he had the kids watch a number of documentaries about the events of the time, such as the 1955 murder of Emmett Till for, quote, flirting with a white woman, and the need for federal troops to integrate Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas in 1957. The comment I remember from the kids afterwards was that they learned about the civil rights movement in school. They'd studied Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. They'd heard about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus, but that was the extent of it. These kids had no idea of the whole history that went on. That was part of my history. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I remembered that stuff. And it's probably because of my memories and that being my history that my freedom hero will always be Martin Luther King Jr. Throughout his incredible life, King suffered many setbacks and defeats before he saw the glimpses of freedom for which he fought so valiantly. In one of his most famous quotes, he said, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded from the oppressed." And he set out to do just that, demand freedom. In his steadfast, nonviolent persistence, he marched, agitated, met with friend and foe, went to prison, and until his death led a movement that made steady but slow progress toward freedom for his people and for all people. I have it's not too lengthy, but I'm almost done. Dr. King gave the Ware Lecture at the General Assembly in 1966. Our General Assembly, the UU General Assembly, in 1966 in Hollywood, Florida. These are his concluding comments. He gives me hope. I have not despaired of the future. I believe firmly that we can solve this problem. I know that there are still difficult days ahead, and there are days of glorious opportunity. Our goal for America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of history the words that I just quoted from the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most oppressive and humiliating conditions. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to grow and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition we now face surely will fail. We're going to win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And we can sing, "We shall overcome," because somehow we know that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. We will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood and speed up that day, and you'll all recognize this, when all of God's children all over our nation and the world will be able to walk the earth as brothers and sisters, and then we can sing the words of that old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Thank you.
Thank you, Joey. So I am your second speaker today. I agreed to be one of the speakers before I realized that I was also service leader. So you will have your fill of me by the end of today. As I started gathering my thoughts and words for this presentation, I started by thinking about Thomas Jefferson. I shared a few quotes of his at the opening of today's service, and I've greatly admired many of his ideals. And I love that Joey was able to bring around that his ideals and what he believed in terms of individual freedom has another side to it that I think also needs to be recognized. But I think we can recognize that in terms of an and. He had wonderful ideals about individual freedoms, and he was a slave owner. One does not negate the other. So as I dived into research about Thomas Jefferson and his impact on current society, I continually returned to a theme that felt even more important to me, and a theme that more accurately conveys my reflections on freedom. And that's the inextricable link between freedom and responsibility. We Americans have a set of rights which allow us freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. We're free to live our lives without undue government intrusion. And we have rights that our government is bound to protect. But we have a responsibility to protect those freedoms. And I believe we also have a responsibility to use them, and to use them well. So in thinking about the responsibility to protect the freedoms, I want to talk for a while about the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. I think that their history is really important to understand. And so I'm going to read you some information from their materials about their history. In the years following World War I, America was gripped by the fear that the communist revolution that had taken place in Russia would spread to the United States. As is often the case when fear outweighs rational debate, civil liberties paid the price. In November 1919 and January 1920, in what was notoriously known as the Palmer Raids, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer began rounding up and deporting so-called radicals. Thousands of people were arrested without warrants and without regard to constitutional protections against unlawful search and seizure. Those that were arrested were brutally treated and held in horrible conditions. In the face of these egregious civil liberty abuses, a group of people decided to take a stand, and they formed the American Civil Liberties Union. One of the ACLU's earliest battle was the Scopes trial of 1925. When the state of Tennessee passed a law banning the teaching of evolution, the ACLU recruited biology teacher John Scopes to challenge the law by teaching the banned subjects. When Scopes was eventually prosecuted, the ACLU partnered with the celebrated attorney Clarence Darrow to defend him. And although Scopes was found guilty, the verdict was later overturned because of a sentencing error. That trial made national headlines, and it helped to persuade the public on the importance of academic freedom. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered all people of Japanese descent, most of whom were American citizens, sent to war relocation camps. Eventually, more than 110,000 Japanese Americans were sent to these internment camps. And the ACLU, led by its California affiliates, stood alone in speaking out about this. That's what the ACLU says. I know that there were other organizations that were speaking out, but they certainly had a very important role. In 1954, the ACLU joined forces with the NAACP to challenge racial segregation in public schools. The ACLU was also involved in the 1973 Supreme Court victories in Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, which held that the right to privacy encompasses a woman's right to decide whether she will terminate or continue a pregnancy. And then in 2003, the ACLU helped persuade the Supreme Court to expand the privacy rights established in Roe when it struck down a Texas law making sexual intimacy between same-sex couples a crime. One of the most noted moments in ACLU history occurred in '78 when the ACLU defended a Nazi group that wanted to march through the Chicago suburb of Skokie, Illinois, where many Holocaust survivors lived. The ACLU persuaded a federal court to strike down 3 ordinances that placed significant restrictions on the Nazis' First Amendment right to march and express their views. The decision to take the case was a demonstration of the ACLU's commitment to the principle that constitutional rights must apply to even the most unpopular groups if they're going to be preserved for everyone. Many now consider this one of the ACLU's finest hours. That commitment to principle in difficult situations continues today. Since the tragic terrorist attacks of 9/11, the ACLU has been working to oppose policies that sacrifice our fundamental freedoms in the name of national security. From opposing the Patriot Act to challenging warrantless spying to challenging the indefinite detention of terrorism suspects without charge or trial, the ACLU is committed to restoring fundamental freedoms lost as a result of policies that expand the government's power. I want to talk personally about the work of the ACLU as well. When my son was 6 or 8 years old or so, he asked about the march by Nazi sympathizers. I'm not entirely sure how he heard about it, but he asked about it. And he asked, how come we let them march? And I found myself trying to explain in 6-year-old terms why this was important and important to me. And I came down to everyone should have a voice, even if we disagree with them. And then 2 weeks ago, my now 12-year-old asked me why the Westboro Baptist Church was allowed to protest at the funerals of people who were killed at the Pulse nightclub and hold up those hateful signs. For those of you who are unaware of this group, the Westboro Baptist Church believes that homosexuality is a sin, and they make headlines by protesting at funerals and holding up signs that say things like, God hates fags, and God sent the shooter, and other similarly hateful views. So my son's question about why they were allowed was another opportunity for us to discuss the ideal that people have the freedom to hold awful, repugnant, hateful, and damaging beliefs. And they have the freedom to say them out loud and in public. 2 weeks ago, many police officers were assigned to the church protest so that they could exercise their freedom of speech and so that no harm would come to them while they were protesting. But we have the freedom to comment and respond to their beliefs. So at the funeral, over 200 people came as counter-protesters. They formed a human chain so that the people attending the funeral would not have to see the protesters or their hateful messages. But it was even better than that. A group of people working with the theater community in Orlando, centered at the Orlando Shakespeare Theater, devised an idea. And they created a contraption that they could wear made out of PVC pipe and white cloth that had long, tall, 6-foot-tall PVC pipe up and out to create what looked like angels' wings. They went to the site and they stood wingtip to wingtip, forming a solid white cloth in front of the protesters from Westboro Baptist Church so that the people who were mourning could mourn in peace. That's our responsibility, to use our rights. The Westboro Baptist Church people had their rights. We have our rights. We can use our rights as a counter-protest to things that happen. So let me sum up this example. The ACLU brought the original case against the Nazis. The courts decided that people had the freedom of speech, even when we disagree with what they're saying. 2 weeks ago, the police officers took seriously their responsibility to protect the people's freedom of speech. And more than 200 people took seriously their responsibility to exercise freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and counter-protest. I want to urge you to take seriously my idea that we have a responsibility to protect these freedoms, these civil liberties, even for groups that we dislike, and even in times when we are afraid. I also want to urge you to take seriously the idea that we have a responsibility to use these freedoms. Write a letter to the editor. Become involved in a cause. Talk to your neighbors. Buy a subscription to your favorite newspaper to help keep investigative journalism alive. But there's more to the responsibility. I want to urge you to consider one of our principles here supporting the free and responsible search for truth. See, again, those two words come together, free and responsible. In today's climate, there's a lot of polarization in the political discourse, and I want to encourage you to learn what your opponents believe and why they believe it. If you're in favor of gun control, do some reading about why gun supporters oppose it. You might learn something. Might change your mind, it might not. But at the least, you'll know more about why they believe what they do. If you can't state their position and give some supporting evidence for why they believe what they believe, then you have more work to do. You've not fully exercised your responsibility. So let me close by encouraging you to enjoy and cherish the freedoms that we do have, and remember that you are responsible for protecting these freedoms, and you have a responsibility to use them to make this a better country, to make it, in these well-known words, to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our prosperity. So be responsible and be free. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Martha Kirby. Always a challenge to follow such wonderful, well-educated, well-versed people that know all this history. It's really, really good. Mine will be a little more from the heart. Not that yours is not, but two things I want to share before we start. Westboro Baptist also came to General Assembly, and because they were protesting our inclusivity and we have several workshops on transgender understanding and being able to, just know where people are coming from and how important it is to honor people's self-identified gender. And they were there. I was at lunch with the reproductive justice people, so I missed them. But they were once again surrounded with love. And they left very quickly. And First U sent the angels from Orlando out there. So they had 10 angels that surrounded them in the lobby of the Hyatt. And they didn't stay very long. I think when they get met with that kind of love, they don't know what else to do. And I was going to mention one other thing that you just mentioned, but I've forgotten it now. So it'll come back. Or not. We never can tell. So when I started contemplating my words for today, I first thought of family and friends and fireworks. That's what we do on the 4th of July, right? And then as I started reading and Googling, because that's what I always do, my thoughts took off in a more complex direction, and I just kept reading more and more from different people and different sources. There's so much to talk about when it comes to freedom and who has it and who doesn't. Freedom is a definition, the power to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. Of course, with the caveat of do no harm. We hear a lot about freedom from religion, freedom from oppression, freedom from discrimination, and freedom of speech, religion, the right to bear arms, the right to make our own decisions. You've heard a little bit about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution from Sarah and Joey. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, establish justice, promote the general welfare. All of these mean different things to different people, particularly when seen through the lenses of individual race, social, economic class, religious background, and gender. Many political, religious, and secular people have said wonderfully inspiring and thoughtful words about freedom. In a 1941 message to Congress, Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to explain what it means to be free. He outlined the 4 essential freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression. The second is freedom of every person to worship. The third is freedom from want. And the fourth, freedom from fear. Those last two are pretty difficult to accomplish, especially today. Dwight D. Eisenhower, only our individual faith in freedom can keep us free, keep us and others by constantly working towards it. That's Albert Einstein. Everything that is really great and inspiring is created by the individual who can labor in freedom. And Malcolm X, you can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he or she or they have their freedom. I read these words and then I just sit there and think, and your mind goes in so many different directions. Where are we today and what can we do to ensure that everybody has access to exercise the rights that they're guaranteed? One of the talks I was at General Assembly, I don't remember now which one it was because I went to so many, but they mentioned the Ripple speech by Robert F. Kennedy, made to the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He was addressing the National Union of South African Students. I said NUSAS, and I forgot what it stood for. National Union of South African Students. His Day of Affirmation speech, June 6, 1996. It's 10 pages. I'm going to read just a little bit of an excerpt from it. I came here because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British, and at last independent. A land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day. A land which defined itself on a hostile frontier. A land which has tamed rich natural resources through the energetic application of modern technology. A land which once imported slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of that former bondage. I refer, of course, to the United States of America. This is a day of affirmation, a celebration of liberty. We stand here in the name of freedom. At the heart of that Western freedom and democracy is the belief that the individual man, the child of God, is the touchstone of value, and all society, groups, the state exist for his benefit. Therefore, the enlargement of liberty for individual human beings must be the supreme goal and the abiding practice of any Western society. The first element of this individual liberty is the freedom of speech, the right to express and communicate ideas, to set oneself apart from the dumb beast of field and forest, to recall governments to their duties and obligations. Above all, the right to affirm one's membership and allegiance to the body politic, to society, to the men with whom we share our land, our heritage, and our children's future. Hand in hand with freedom of speech goes the power to be heard, to share in the decisions of government which shape men's life. Everything that makes man's life worthwhile, family, work, education, a place to rear one's children, and a place to rest one's head. All this depends on decisions of government. All can be swept away by government which does not heed the demands of its people. Therefore, the essential humanity of men can be protected and preserved only where government must answer, not just to the wealthy, not just to those of a particular religion or a particular race, but to all its people. We must recognize the full human equality of all our people before God, before the law, and in the councils of government. We must do this not because it is economically advantageous, although it is, not because the laws of God command it, although they do, not because people in other lands wish it so. We must do it for the single and fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do. In a few hours, the plane that brought me to this country crossed over oceans and countries which have been a crucible of human history. In minutes, we traced the migration of men over thousands of years. In seconds, the briefest glimpse, and we passed battlefields on which millions of men once struggled and died. We could see no national boundaries, no vast gulfs or high walls dividing people from people. Only nature and the works of man, homes and factories and farms, everywhere reflecting man's common effort to enrich his life. Everywhere new technology and communications bring men and nations closer together. The concerns of one inevitably become the concerns of all. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lots of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And with a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. So I shared these words of others for inspiration and understanding as to where my contemplation has led me. Achieving freedom has to start with relationships and understanding the other. My recent trip to the UU General Assembly provided much inspiration for me as I attended panels on reproductive justice, sermons on Black Lives Matter, and workshops on interfaith understanding and relationships. Freedom cannot be separated from justice, and the work of justice needs many hands. Deep listening to those who do not feel heard, particularly blacks, people of color, the LGBT community, the disabled, the elderly, the young. There's so many people that do not feel their voices are heard. A directive from the College of Justice said that we need to listen with glad curiosity. And our Ware lecturer, 50 years after Martin Luther King Jr., she was a little nervous knowing she was following him. But Krista Tippett from NPR said words matter, and a question is a mighty form of words. We need to learn to ask questions to others, especially those we don't understand, and listen actively. We don't always have to have an opinion at that moment. We can listen and let them be heard and reflect on it and learn what we need to help build relationships. Because listening, active and deep listening, is an important part of words. And remembering, well, I just said that, we don't have to have an opinion. Relationship is the sandpaper that wears away our resistance to change. Someone said that in one of the sermons, and it just really struck to me. I like that idea. You've got to build relationships to get to the essence of humanity, which is between our fingers as we reach to each other. That was another young man that recited a poem he had written. He was incredible. But there's much work to be done, and it starts in our community and ripples outwards. And my goal is to connect with others in our community and begin the dialogue and understanding that will make freedom really exist for all of us. And walls turned sideways are bridges. That was a quote from Angela Davis, and I forgot to wear my pin this morning. But that's where we are. We've had a lot of sorrow in our community the last few weeks, but yet the hope and the love and the coming together that's been demonstrated has just been remarkable. And it was there at General Assembly, and we need to keep that work going now while not letting it lax again. Anyway, thank you. Thank you. Okay. We've talked a lot, and we didn't quite fill up all our time, although we did better than I expected. Is there anyone that would like to share some of their reflections on freedom? So Evelyn and then Lydia. I'll watch for hands.
I think we have time for
4 people? Okay.
I just wanted to make a quick comment about the Westboro people, because I have found that while you try and understand why somebody might hold what they claim to be their religious views and so forth, they have been very avaricious in terms of deliberately provoking a confrontation, and they have sued, and they have made a lot of money. So one begins to wonder where the principle ends and that sort of behavior, begins.
Lydia?
I just want to say we have to really recognize where our concept of freedom and justice originate. And it always originates within ourselves. It's all very well to talk about countries and nations, but in the final analysis, it resides within ourselves. I'm always a little apprehensive when I remember Nathaniel Hawthorne's quotation, "There is no dungeon as dark as one's own heart, or no jailer so cruel as oneself." And I think of the children who grew up with those people from the Baptist church. What a horrible childhood that must be. I mean, just having us white people who know the truth be a part of your life and no one else. That must be horrible. Also, I just want to say, if anybody has seen this picture, the United States of Jones, did anyone see that? Please, please, please see that. As a matter of fact, you should have an excursion to see that. It's a true story. It's a true story of a a person from the Confederate soldier during the Civil War who actually left the Confederacy and really established his own place. But it gives you a whole history.
Thank you.
Please see that picture.
Kathy McCambridge, and then I saw John and Chloe at the same time, so maybe we can do two if they're not too.
The perspective from the Native community, they largely do not celebrate this day at all. In fact, they often hang their flags upside down in distress because they are still 30 years behind Black Lives Matter movements. They are still living without food, electricity, running water. Eli Wiesel said, "It isn't hate that he worries about." That wasn't what he worried about. What he worried about was indifference.
So, yeah, Chloe and then John McCormick, and that should.
I just wanted to make a comment for the first part. For the first speech that was given about the Revolutionary War and freedom with that. A statement about the Revolutionary War is that the 1st Black Battalion was created for the Revolutionary War. And Revolutionary War as a freedom for the country. But as the Revolutionary War ended, everybody who was in that Black Battalion was returned to their masters. And I think that says something about our freedom here and how much we progressed, but how much there's still to gain freedom-wise in this country.
Amen.
I would just like to remind everybody also that today, which is a beautiful sunny day out, that we are free to enjoy it and to really enjoy the freedom that we have, the places where we live, the friends that we have, and we are free for the day. So enjoy your freedom.
Thank you all.